Okay, so Joan had asked a question about Lutherans making the sign of the cross. Okay, and she seemed to recall that I had said something about that somewhere, and where did that come from? And she wanted me to comment on that. So, Joan, this is for you. Can you hear me? Maybe? Well, anyways, I think you're on. She might be having trouble because I noticed she tried to get on twice, but she can always see it on the on YouTube. So where we see this is actually in Luther's Small Catechism, and Luther says that for the morning and evening prayer, or evening blessing, morning blessing, he says, this is the instructions. In the morning, as soon as you get out of bed, you are to make the sign of the Holy Cross and say, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, watch over me. Amen. And then there's a suggestion to say the Apostles' Creed and the Lord's Prayer, as well as a little prayer off to the side. And then Luther says the same thing again in the evening. So basically, in Luther's Small Catechism, Luther indicates that one of the reforms, like in his reforms of worship, he's not getting rid of making the sign of the cross. So there's a number of Lutherans who have started doing that as part of their worship practice, in the last couple of decades. It's getting to be a little more common. But when I was a kid, we never did that because that was the Roman Catholics, right? And yet, actually, that's incorrect because it's not just Catholics. It's been Lutherans. It's been Orthodox, so whatnot. Anyways, we get a chat here. Joan, I can hear and thanks. Okay, there you go, Joan. All right. So usually you start at the head, right head, and go down to the breastbone or something like that, and then left shoulder to right shoulder. That's sort of the typical way. Yeah. So it's it's to remind you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? That's kind of it. Yeah. Anyways, that has very little to do with our session today. What we're other than it's a sign of the Trinity. So we left off last week talking about the Trinity, and we're going to start off this week talking about the Trinity, and we're going to move into the first person of the Trinity as God the Father is known. Let's begin with prayer. Gracious God, we thank you that you have called us into relationship with you, and that you are our protector, our provider, and our mentor. And we ask that as we work through this study tonight, that your Spirit would lead and guide us in our thoughts and in our discussion. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So if you're going to talk about God, where is a natural starting point? The natural starting point is God as creator. And why is that a natural starting point? Well, because as humans look at the universe around them, they have always wondered, where did all this come from, right? All cultures, all historical records, there are stories of origins, because humans are curious, and we ask questions like, well, why is this like this, and where did this come from, and how is this, come to be, and so on and so forth. So, Eric, let's see if you can just find a spot. Is your mom coming in too? Okay, all right. So they're right between Colleen and Mary there. Perfect. So humans have always wondered that. And so religions have answered this question by affirming that God, or in some cases the gods, brought the world, including humans, into being. But different cultures have expressed their creation stories differently, and we're looking specifically at the Judeo-Christian story. Science in the last few centuries have also asked the question of origins, and this has led to an apparent conflict with science. And the key word there is the word apparent. Oh, and I just realized I didn't even do this. Hang on. I did that last time too. All right. So the first conflicts with the Judeo-Christian understanding of creation were astronomical in nature. And by that, I don't mean large. but literally having to do with astronomy, right? And so Copernicus, and then later Galileo, observed that the Earth revolved around the sun and not the other way. So, they said, no, the universe is, our solar system is heliocentric rather than Earth-centric. So it revolved around the sun. But that was problematic because the way certain scriptures are written, it's like the sun rises and sets and that the sun is going around the Earth. Like that's, and now, even when we look at this, there's an interesting bit of history that a lot of people don't know, and that is Copernicus was actually funded by the church. Like his studies was basically supported by the church financially. And so they didn't have a problem initially because they felt that if you were trying to observe and understand God's creation, that was a good task, a good and noble task. And that's what Copernicus was trying to do. When Galileo shows up a couple of generations later, he affirms the same thing that Copernicus said. But now the problem is that this is becoming a bit of a threat to the primacy of the Roman Catholic Church. And Galileo, was friends with the Pope. But the Pope, said, you can't teach this stuff, Galileo, because it contradicts what we've been teaching. So you have to be quiet. So Galileo doesn't lose his life, probably because he was friends with the Pope, but he is silenced. So a lot of people then looked at that and said, see, the church is always against science, but that's not accurate. That was a specific moment in time, and there was a problem. But that's the first one. So astronomy, increased understanding of how the universe works led to this apparent conflict. Yes? Why did the church at that time think it was a conflict? I think because at that time, this is around the same time as the Reformation and whatnot, there's a lot of unrest in Europe. And there's a sense in which I think the Roman Catholic Church was having a sense of losing control. And so, of course, when you have a sense of losing control, then you want to hold on to it tighter. And I think that was it. Now, remembering that at the time, the Roman Catholic Church in Europe was a major institution. Like it was the glue that held Europe together. And the Pope was really, in some ways, he was more like the CEO of a huge corporation than he was a spiritual leader. And you see that very clearly in the behavior of some popes. Other popes were a little more spiritual in nature, but others were about the business. And so if you're about the business, right, then anything that could possibly upset that business and interrupt the how that business functions becomes a problem. And I think that's why it was a problem specifically at that time, right? So now that's the first major conflict, okay? And so often you'll hear people say, well, yeah, the church shut up Galileo and they've been telling scientists from then on to shut up. That's not true. Okay, a few centuries later, observations by the biologist Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, or the origins of species, led to a further conflict with people of faith. So then people started saying, look, Darwin is saying that we evolved from apes, and yet the Bible says we were created by God, and so this is a problem. And so that seemed to indicate that science is in conflict with faith. I need to address this question right near the beginning of my class at Luther because that's the assumption so many students make, right? Science has already brought us into conflict with faith and religion, okay? But I'm going to suggest that that is a false understanding, and we're going to explore it by exploring a particular person and his approach. So does anyone recognize what this is? Yes, it's the retreat center at Lumsden, St. Michael's Retreat, back in the days when the Franciscans ran it. And one of the Franciscans there, who I came to appreciate, was Father Lucian Kimball. And Father Lucian Kimball was, not all Franciscans are priests, but he happened to be both a priest and a Franciscan. The Franciscan movement was a lay movement, but some of them became priests, okay? And so he was one of the people out at St. Michael's who helped run the place. Sadly, what eventually happened is that they just got too old and too many of them died off and there wasn't enough to keep working, and that's why they had to eventually sell it. But in my early years at teaching at Luther, I actually used to take classes out to St. Michael's Retreat Center for a day-long retreat. And as part of that day-long retreat, one of the Franciscans, often Lucian, would come and speak to the class. And it was Lucian who introduced me to something I had no clue about before, and it opened a whole new world for me, and that is the Fibonacci sequence. So any of you heard of the Fibonacci sequence? Oh, a few of you are nodding. Okay, good. All right. But before we get there, I have to tell you that Lucian Kimball was an incredibly gifted amateur scientist. So he didn't get paid for his work, is what I'm saying. But he was very, very skilled at observing nature, both in terms of this world that we're on, but also the skies. In fact, he was so good of an amateur astronomer that he identified this thing called Kimball's Cascade. So it's named after him because he identified it. So you can you kind of see that line of stars that looks like a little bit of a cascade or a river flowing down? That was named after him because he was the one who identified it. And he told us that you could see it, at the right time of year, you could see it just with a pair of decent binoculars. So you don't even need a high-powered telescope to see this pattern of stars. He had articles published in astronomy journals, and he was highly regarded in the world of astronomy. Like, he was a member of the Royal Astronomy Society of Canada and stuff, and if you go to their site, you can find articles about him and written by him. So he was very, very good scientist in the sense that he was a very good observer of nature, and he thought things through, okay? So he's the one who taught me about the Fibonacci sequence. So what is the Fibonacci sequence? First of all, who is Fibonacci? Fibonacci, or as his full name is, Leonardo Fibonacci, he was the most outstanding mathematician of the European Middle Ages. By Middle Ages, we mean like the sort of the 11th and 12th centuries. He was known by other names, including Leonardo Pisano or Leonard of Pisa. So, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, that's where he functioned out of. Little was known, or is known about his life, except for the few facts given in his mathematical writings. So what we know about him is stuff that was in his textbooks. First of all, so he was born around 1170, and he received his early education from a Muslim schoolmaster. Here's what you need to know about that era. In that era, the highest level of civilization in Europe was in southern Spain. And in southern Spain, that was Muslim territory. And they had high level of civilization, so highly developed arts, sciences, what we would call sciences today, administration, so on and so forth. So the largest city at that time in Europe was Cordoba, Spain. Cordoba had 1 million inhabitants at that time. You compare that with London and Paris at that time, and they were around 15,000. So it was the place where really good education was happening. Because remember, most of Europe was in what has also been known as the Dark Ages, right? And so some of the Renaissance really happened because they eventually kind of some of this learning from southern Spain migrated into other areas of Europe, like Italy, and that was the case for Fibonacci. So in case you didn't know, and a few more things. So his book that he published in 1202 is devoted to arithmetic and elementary algebra. And his next book was written in 18 years later, in 1220. That talks about geometry and trigonometry with its Greek origins. So the thing about what happened, like the Greeks had a high sophistication of culture and civilization and things like mathematics, right? But so much of that got lost during the Dark Ages. But it was carried on, it was continued by these people in southern Spain. Andalusia. Oh, I can't even. Anyways, that's the name of that, how they referred to themselves. So they were building off, they were returning to or rediscovering. So the Renaissance also was rediscovering what the Greeks did. Like that was a big part of the Renaissance is, and so they would look at Greek sculpture and then they would try and imitate it and so on and so forth, right? Like that was that. All right, so if you go to Pisa, by the way, you can find a statue of Leonardo Fibonacci. He was the first, or one of the first people to introduce the Hindu-Arabic number system to Europe, which is what we use today. So up to that point in Europe, what was being used? What kind of numeratical system do you think was being used? Roman numerals. Yeah. So you know X, XI, XII, XII, XIV, XV, and all that stuff, right? That's what they were using. Using 1, 2, 3. A lot of people don't realize that numbering system came to us from India through Arabia. And so we use Arabic numbers, basically. Anyways, his textbook, I guess we could call it, was the European standard for more than 2 centuries, and it was his textbook that helped replace the Roman numerical system with this other system. And now, like I said, you can see a statue of him in Pisa, pretty close to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Anyone here been to Pisa by any chance? Did you happen to notice Fibonacci's statue? No?
I was too young then.
Yeah, okay, anyways. If I ever get there, I'm going to make a point of finding this statue. Anyways, so now, what is the sequence? Here is the sequence. Let's see if you can figure out how it works. Let's take a look at that. We got one busy church happening tonight. Messy church upstairs, HR committee meeting in the lounge. We got a 12-step group meeting down the hallway, and we're meeting here. We were just talking about that. All right, so
I know what it is, but I don't
you know what it is. Okay, you know what it is. Who didn't know about Fibonacci sequence before? Who can see it now? Someone is. You can see what it is? Okay. Oh, Heather's got it too, yeah. Okay, so the way it works is each number, you add the 2 previous numbers together to get the next number, right? But if I just rattled those numbers off to you, if I just said, here's the sequence, and you're just trying to think about it. So 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55. You would think there's no pattern to that. It seems almost random.
The next one is 89.
Yeah, yeah. And so now here's the thing that Lucian told me. He said, this Fibonacci numbers, so these numbers, okay, they show up in nature all the time. All the time. These numbers. So here's examples. We'll get to this here. One of the most interesting ways is in the heads of like seeds, like in a sunflower head or other things. You'll notice that they make spirals, right? And always the spirals are 2 concurrent Fibonacci numbers. So in this case, we've got 34 spirals going the one way and 21 going the other way. So
Nature just did that?
Nature just did that, yeah. And you can see the same kind of spiral stuff. What I remember Lucian talking about was a different example, and that example was pineapples. And he said whenever he went to the grocery store, he would pick up a pineapple and he would count the number rows that went the one way and then the number of rows that went the other way. And he said it was always Fibonacci numbers. So if you look at the pine cone on the left there, okay, here's taking that pine cone and showing the spirals. So you got 13 and 8 in this case. All right? So that's the one place. You see it in the spirals of things. So if you were patient one day and you saw a sunflower head, you could do this exact same exercise with that. And now look at the bottom there. You can see there's the Fibonacci sequence going right up to 2084, and obviously it can go on forever, right? All right, but that's not the only place it shows up in nature, not just in these spirals. It shows up in petals. By the way, there's spirals in cauliflower too. And I'm not sure what that green plant is. I don't know, but there's spirals in that plant. I got this slide from somewhere else. Now, speaking of flowers, so most flowers have a Fibonacci number of petals. So you have flowers like lilies that have one petal. You have flowers like euphorbias that have 2 petals. You have flowers like trilliums that have 3 petals. Columbines that have 5. Bloodroot that have 8. Black-eyed Susans, 13, and so forth. I think if I remember correctly, daisies are 34. I think, but anyways, that's so Lucian said when he was out walking, walking in the hills around Lumsden, and if he saw a flower, he would stop and count the petals and things like that, right? So that's one place it shows up. But there's also something known as the spiral, Fibonacci spiral. So this is how you build it. Do you see that little red box there? Okay, that's a unit of 1. If we give that a unit of 1, okay, so the sequence is 1, 1. So now we're going to add 1. Okay, so now we've got 1, 1. And now we've got a side that's 2 units. But we're going to add the 2 to that, and beside that, so where's my little, here we go, 2, okay, and now we've got a side, a rectangle that's got a side of 3 units, so we add the square there, and then you just keep adding the squares around. See how that's working? Yes? Okay, and now what you have to do is you take and you draw, like you just take and you draw from the corner through all the corners, and you end up with this spiral. Okay, do you see how that works? You see the red line that goes through all the corners of the boxes or the squares? Okay, that spiral, that shows up all over in nature too. And some of these you will recognize as soon as you see them. Okay, the nautilus shell is probably the most famous example of it. So if you cut a nautilus shell in half, it grows in the shape of a Fibonacci spiral. Human ears are often in the shape of a spiral. Eggs are in the shape of this spiral. But hurricanes is one thing. So you've seen a hurricane map, right? Hurricanes form in the shape of a Fibonacci spiral. But that's not all. It goes. This is just stuff on planet Earth. Spiral galaxies also take the shape of a Fibonacci spiral, often 2 of them together, right? So we go from the micro, like that fern, how a fern grows, to the macro, this spiral universes. And yet all have this particular shape. All right. Trees grow. Many trees grow according to the Fibonacci system. I don't know if when you were a kid, you grew a tree, like you had to draw a tree. I mean, you didn't grow it. You drew a tree, and you went one trunk, and then you did 2 branches off that, and then each of those did 2 branches, and each of those. And then when you finish, that doesn't really look like a tree, because trees don't grow that way. They grow this way. So you get one trunk that leads to one, the next level up, and then 2, and then it branches out to 3, which branch out to 5, which branch out to 8, and so forth, right? And so if you go and look at trees, often you will find that the way it branches out is using the Fibonacci series. So one other thing, and this is where the Greeks picked this up, is something called the golden ratio. So the golden ratio is when you take two Fibonacci numbers, one over top of the other, and you end up with a ratio of 1.6180 dot, 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 right? And so that ratio is known as phi in algebra, I guess. The law, or maybe it'd be geometry, maybe more than that. Anyways, where it shows up is in something called the golden rectangle. So you take that 61.8 over 100, right? That rectangle, the Greeks said, that is the most pleasing rectangle to the human senses. How they figured this stuff out, I don't know. But what you will find is that in Greek architecture, they use this golden rectangle all the time. So and now architects and historians, whatever, they've discovered this, that this rectangle is used. So the shape of a, like you've seen ruins of the front of temples, right? And they all look kind of be the same dimensions. That's because they're using the golden rectangle. It was intentional, right? So the Greeks used the rectangle in their architectural designs. And then when the Renaissance artists came along, they picked up this stuff and they go, oh, this ratio, this golden ratio, is pleasing to the eye and also to the ear. So I'll show you where that is, okay? But this is maybe the most famous painting of Leonardo da Vinci. If you are an art historian and you look at Leonardo da Vinci's work, so much of it is filled with Fibonacci stuff, right? So here is Mona Lisa, maybe the most famous Leonardo da Vinci painting, and her face is this, fits within this, perfectly within this golden rectangle. But that's not all. This is my favorite one. The whole painting is structured around this Fibonacci spiral, right? And so the placement of the hands was done precisely so that, the way that it all works, starting from the nose and going out and whatnot. And why did Leonardo da Vinci do that? Because he said that's the most pleasing thing for the human eye. He maybe didn't theorize why. He just said the Greeks knew this, and I'm just building on what the Greeks knew, right?
I saw her.
Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
Not alive, surely, did you?
There in Paris.
Oh, you were okay. You saw the painting. Good. Here's another favorite one of mine: is the hand, human hand. So if you take your first section of finger and count that as unit of 2, then the next one is going to be a unit of 3. The next one is a unit of 5, and then what's in your palm or in your hand is 8. And then lots of animals. You can find these proportions in animals. And you can't see it as well, but that's a famous drawing by Leonardo da Vinci of the human form, and it's got the ratio in there too. Okay, all right. Now, music. When I was a kid, I always wondered, why is the piano keyboard the way it is, with 2 black notes grouped together and 3 black notes grouped together, and so on and so forth. But look, it's all Fibonacci. You've got a group of 2 against a group of 3. You've got a group of 3 against a group of 5. And you've got a group of 5 against a group of 8. And the chords and stuff we form with those 8 notes, right, are pleasing to the ear. Pretty astonishing, right? And so Lucian Kimball would say, when I look around the world and I see all this stuff and I see this pattern, this mathematical pattern everywhere, it leads me to believe that this is the fingerprint of God. In other words, it's evidence of God's presence. It shows, similar to how a fingerprint from a sculptor might be on the statue. In the same way, this is evidence that there was intentionality, that there was design, that this was put in place in a way that is way more sophisticated than we realized at first. Okay, so that's what Lucian Kimball said, and so for him, he didn't see that keen observation of nature conflicted with his faith at all. And in fact, he said it enhanced faith. And we've had others who, I'll come to that in a minute. We've had others who have said that. How many of you remember Doug Sovereign? So Doug Sovereign was the husband of Kristen Sovereign, who became a pastor. They were members of the church here. Doug was a scientist. He worked at the Saskatchewan Research Council. And when he was a young man, when he was, I think, still in university, the thing that deepened his faith was when he got thinking about water. He said, water is fascinating, like this simple H2O, right? Two hydrogen molecules, one oxygen molecule, and we need it for life. And it, on planet Earth, it exists in all three states, solid, liquid, and gas, right? But it has very unique properties that no other thing, well, not maybe no other, but few other elements have. And the thing that he said that really got to him was, he said, unlike other elements that when they become a solid, become more dense, water becomes less dense, and that's why ice floats. And if ice doesn't float, then in wintertime, all the animals, all the creatures in a lake would die. But because the ice floats and then forms a sort of a skin, or like insulation, then the fish and other water creatures can live even through the winter. And so it was things like that led Doug Sovereign to say that's got to be, somebody figured that out. Like, in other words, God made water function this way so that life could function the way that it does. Now, the other thing I do when I teach my classes, I point out that there are currently, or within our recent history, people who are both deeply faithful people of faith, and top-notch scientists. And so I give two examples, and this is the first one, John Polkinghorne. So John Polkinghorne was an English theoretical physicist, and he was a professor of mathematical physics at the University of Cambridge. So Cambridge, one of the top universities in the world, right, in England, and he taught there as a professor from 1968 to 1979. In 1979, he shocked all his colleagues by retiring from teaching and becoming a Church of England minister. He became a pastor. And they all said, "What are you doing, John? You got this good career in physics, and why are you giving up that good career?" And this is what he said. He said, "In physics, most important discoveries are made by people under the age of 40. So in their earlier years. For example, Einstein, all of his most important work happened before he even hit 30, right? So John said, any contributions I had to make to the world of physics, I've probably made already. He says, and now I want to make contributions to humanity in another way. What John Polkinghorne did, and how I found out about him, is he wrote books about science and faith and about their coexistence and how they could be together. And so I appreciated his writings. Okay, so that's one, John Polkinghorne. Okay, so that's the area of physics. But what about the area of biology? Because that seems to be one that's going to be problematic. Well, we've got even a better example. This is Francis Collins. Francis Collins is still alive. John Polkinghorne died a couple of years ago. Francis Collins is an American molecular biologist. That is, he works in the realm of genetics. He led the Human Genome Project. How many of you remember hearing about that? So the Human Genome Project, mapping human DNA. When they set out to do it, they thought this is going to take 10 to 12 years. Under Francis's leadership, they actually did it in about 7. So they got finished earlier than they thought. Then, most recently, he served as the director of the National Institutes of Health. So that's sort of like, basically, he was like the top scientist in the area of biology in all the United States. So you remember during COVID, who was the doctor who was always on the news having to explain things? Dr. Fauci. All right. Francis Collins was Dr. Fauci's boss. Okay, so that tells you the level at which he's which. Now, the interesting thing about Francis Collins is he's an evangelical Christian, and he makes no bones about it. He would teach Sunday school. He taught Sunday school. He worships regularly. He is a person of deep faith, and yet he does not see that his understanding of biology is in conflict with his faith. And so some people would ask him about evolution, and he said, well, what's to say that God didn't use the process of evolution to fulfill creation, right? And there's nothing to say that. And we're going to look at the creation stories in a little bit here. But I use these examples just to say that if you automatically think that science and religion cannot coexist, there are lots of examples of people who know a lot more than you do, right, that say otherwise. And that's these guys. So whether you're talking about Lucien Kimball, or you're talking about John Polkinghorne, or you're talking about Francis Collins, these are all people who are very skilled in both areas, both faith and science. All right, so what we can conclude is this: there is no inherent conflict between science and faith because they ask different questions. Science asks how, that is, questions of mechanics and functioning, whereas faith asks why, questions of meaning and purpose, right? So unless one attempts to read the creation accounts in Genesis as a scientific textbook, the Bible does not come into conflict with scientific understanding of the world's origins, right? And that's where the problem is. When people take those first 2 chapters of Genesis and say, this is a literal account of the origin of the world, rather than that this is an account that tells us the meaning of creation. Okay, and we'll get to that in a minute. The other thing to remember is that when the Bible was written, scientific thinking did not exist. Like, we're so used to scientific thinking, we don't realize that there's other ways to think. But they thought very differently. Like, one way to approach this is, if you are familiar with any of the stories that indigenous peoples tell in North America, and they'll tell stories about trickster fox and so on and so forth, right? Well, like, they know that they're not talking about a creature that was actually doing this. These are stories that are talking about meaning and trying to explain things in a creative and memorable way. And so they're used to thinking sort of metaphorically, and they don't even know that they're thinking metaphorically. They just kind of implicitly get it. And I think the ancient people who were an oral culture, they told stories precisely to get at meaning. And they didn't have the ability to write things down in textbooks and explore it that way. So the closest you get to that is the Greek philosophers. Okay, that's sort of the closest you get to using thinking to try and analyze and systematize everything. Most of the other cultures of the ancient world were far less analytical in that regard. Okay, that's enough of that.
I just read something this week that the maps didn't happen till like 1200 or so. Rome did not have a map, even though they had a giant empire.
Yeah.
But they didn't have a map.
Yeah.
And people were going to China over the Silk Road with no map.
Yeah, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. There's the thing to remember about the ancients is that they were just as intelligent as we are, but they just didn't have some of the technology that we have. But in terms of their ability to think and figure things out, and things like the pyramids are an example of that. Yeah, like navigating by the stars, that baffles me. How in the world did they do that? And now we're starting to realize that there is probably good evidence that there was cross-ocean navigation happening even way before we thought.
Yeah, if you watch The Curse of Oak Island, some of the artifacts that they're finding now are way before Columbus came across.
Yeah. Well, we know that the Vikings came across, but that wasn't, we're talking, go back even 1,000 years earlier than that and so forth. And so, yeah, ancient cultures, these people were really intelligent. And I think we do a disservice to them to think that they were somehow less smart than we are. They just had different tools. And in fact, in some ways, because of what they accomplished, I think that shows almost a higher level of intelligence, at least a certain kind of intelligence, right? All right. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the Apostles' Creed, the first article. And this is the article that says, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Okay? So this is the Apostles' Creed is sort of a basic statement of faith of the Christian church that has been in place for hundreds of years. All right. So now we're going to look at this a little more carefully about what these different things mean. So we're going to start with this. To say that God is creator is to say that God is responsible for all that we see around us. Okay? It doesn't say how, it just says who, right? God is responsible for all that's around us. That is, God provides us with a place to live and everything necessary for life. All right? So that's basically what's being said, right? To say God is creator is to say the fact that we can live on this planet and that we have what we need to live, that is because God has made that possible, right?
When kids go to university and learn all these things, do the profs also include the Christian faith in that, do you think?
No. Most often not, unless certain Christian universities might. But I mean, like a sort of a secular university would not. They would just stick with the scientific theory, because this is not a scientific thing that we're talking about. This is faith we're talking about. So the role of a science teacher is to teach science. It's not to teach faith, right? Yeah. So, to say that God is creator does not mean that people of faith cannot use science as a way to understand the workings of the world. Okay? So, to say God is creator doesn't automatically negate the possibility of science. And in fact, we saw lots of examples of that. So, when we look at the biblical story of creation, we see that it's intended to tell us who, not how, so much, and to answer questions of meaning. The creation accounts were written to affirm that we are here on purpose, not by accident, and that God is the one who has brought us into being. This is a meaning question. So when a person asks a question about their life, why am I here? What is the purpose? What is the point of my life? Why am I here? You could say, well, I'm just a biological accident. But that doesn't lead you into a very positive space. If anything, if you take that to the extreme, it's like, well, then my life really doesn't matter, right? I'm just an accident. But if, on the other hand, you say, well, no, I'm here because God intended me to be here, then I must have some kind of purpose. There must be a reason why I'm here. And I may not know what that purpose is right now. I may not understand what my life is supposed to be, but I'll search. I'll search for that meaning. And so that's two different directions here. So the biblical creation accounts, particularly the first one, and we're going to look at both of them, it says, no, you're not an accident. You are here on purpose. And what we will also see is that one of the ways we can see that clearly is by contrasting the biblical creation stories with other creation stories from other cultures at the same time. So we'll get to this. When we look at this first line from the Apostles' Creed, we have the word Father jump out, right? So what does Father suggest? Well, it suggests that God is the one who provides, protects, supports, and mentors. So these are all roles that parents do with their children, right? They provide for their children, provide a home, provide food, protect their children against harm and danger, like don't go out in the ice, it's too thin, and so on and so forth, right? Support their children. You can do this. Come on, you can do this. And mentor. Now, this is how you bake a cake or whatever it might be, right? This is how you do this. This is how you do that. We teach. That's the role of parents. And the ancient Israelites understood that was also what God did, that God provided for them. How? By providing the world for them, right? The world that had all the necessary ingredients to live. That God protected them. And they would tell stories of God's protection, like, for example, the exodus from slavery in Egypt. That God supports them, that God continues to be in relationship with them and helps them to establish themselves as a nation, and so on and so forth. And God mentors. How does God mentor? Well, through the giving of the Ten Commandments, for example. You want to know how to live in a community that gives you the best possible life? This is how you do it. And I think we can all agree that if everyone in a community followed the Ten Commandments, really well, that community would be a pretty positive place to live, right? Because you would have a high level of trust of everyone, because you didn't have to worry about people lying or stealing or cheating, or even being jealous of what you have, or coveting, right? That would make for a positive community. So all those aspects of God, the ancient Israelites understood, and thus why God is considered as a parent, or in this case specifically named as Father. The word Almighty implies that God is all-powerful, that God has the necessary power to both create and sustain creation, including humans. Key word here being sustain. So, unlike the one understanding of God that developed sort of in the 18th century, that God was the great watchmaker, that God put everything in place, wound up the watch, and then just set it free to wind down, but is not involved anymore. Okay? So God is sort of hands off. I made it, now it's running. Okay, that was sort of an understanding that came about a few centuries back. What Christianity believes, as do Jewish, and I'm sure Islam as well, is that God is active in the world still, active in sustaining creation, sustaining our lives. And in fact, you'll see that language in scriptures over and over again. Okay, all right, now here is one of the surprises. Even though the first article of the Creed focuses on God's creative work, that is God the Father's creative work, Scripture reveals that all three persons of the Trinity are involved in the act of creation and sustaining life on earth. So let's take a look. So here's your first passage to look up. 1 Corinthians 8, verses 5 and 6. Okay, so what does it say? Who is involved in creation? The act of creation, according to these verses. Yeah, Jesus. Christ. Creation comes through Christ. So this is, my translation says, yet for us, this is verse 6, yet for us, there is one God, the Father, from whom all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. So notice, even though it doesn't use the term Trinity or anything like that, this is an acknowledgement that Jesus and the Father are one, right? So the concept of the Trinity is being discussed here without using the term Trinity. Now in this case, it's just talking about Jesus and God the Father. All right? But you have that reflection. Now notice what Paul says in the first verse there. He's talking to, remember, people who are very used to a polytheistic pagan world, right? And he says, well, indeed,
even though there may be so-called gods in heaven and on earth, as in fact there are many gods and many lords, small g, small l. So yeah, we've got all these gods that you've got around here that you're worshiping. Well, that's what you do. But we believe in one God. And then proceeds to muddy the waters immediately by saying, and in Jesus, who is one with the Father. And we're like, well, okay, now what do you mean? But that's it. But anyways, so creation comes through Christ, which probably a lot of us don't think of it that way. But yet and creation is sustained through Christ. So then if you just follow this through, the new creation is going to come through who? Through Christ. And so Christ has the power and the authority to bring about the new creation. And that's kind of being affirmed in this as well. Okay? So so there's one. Let's go to the other one. Job 33, verse 4. Now you got to go to Old Testament. Job is just before Psalms, surely.
Okay.
This is just one verse, and depending on your translation, it'll be more clear than others. So, does someone want to read me their version of chapter 33, verse 4? Who's got it handy? Okay, Eric?
The Spirit of God has made me, the breath of the Almighty gives me life.
So, who's involved in sustaining life? The Spirit. The Spirit. And so the NRSV version says, the Spirit of God has made me. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Now, the one thing I will point out, because I want to just be straight up here, this is not Job speaking. This is one of Job's friends. And his friends don't always get everything right. Okay? But I think this is an affirmation that most of a Jewish audience would say, they would go with, oh yeah, we understand that. Yeah. And I could find, there's other passages I could find too that would say that. But basically, the Spirit of God has made me. So I'm just tossing that out there so that you realize when we're talking about creation, this is not exclusive to God the Father, even though, like if we use a different form of the Trinity, we might say we believe in God, Creator, Savior, and Comforter, or like different terms like that, right? But, all right, now let's look at the biblical creation accounts. But let me stop. How are we doing? How are we doing for time? Okay, we're doing okay. Any questions or comments before we go on to the next stuff? I've been going real fast here, but trying to get through all my material.
I just think that the miracle of how would you say, the miracle of creation in the body is the most amazing thing that God ever come up with.
Yeah. Yeah, the human body is pretty amazing.
For a baby to be created it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah. The phrase that comes to us from the Psalms is, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Yeah. And as we get to learn more about the how the human body functions, it's even more astounding than we even can begin to imagine. Like, we're still trying to figure stuff out, right? It's amazing. Any other comments or questions? Anyone out in Zoom land? There's only 2 of you out there today, but no? Okay. All right, well, let's look at the creation accounts. And we're going to start by saying this. The book of Genesis has 2 creation stories that have been placed together, or side by side. They have different styles and different emphases. And one of the problems has been, I think, is that people have tended to smush them together. But if you smush them together, you kind of lose the unique qualities of each one. And again, I don't think the ancients would have thought that this was a problem, that there's 2 stories there. Now, the irony is is that it's, to me, it's really obvious where story 1 ends and story 2 begins. And ironically, the people who did the first numbering system of the Bible did not break at what I thought was an obvious point. So when we talk about Genesis 1, and I'm going to refer to Genesis 1, but that story actually bleeds into Genesis chapter 2 to verse 4, and not just verse 4, verse 4a, the first half of verse 4. So it really is like I don't know what they were thinking when they did that. Maybe they were on coffee break and then they came back and they were rushing or something. I don't know. Anyways, so take a moment to just scan through Genesis chapter 1 and remind yourselves of what that creation story is. Here's one of the things, when you're skimming through it, I want you to look for repeated phrases.
There's 2 of them right away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think you're familiar enough with the story to kind of know the general gist of it. So how does this creation story unfold? Like what is the pattern that you see here?
God said, and God did.
Okay, so you've got this pattern that repeats, right? God said, "Let there be,"
Let there be.
and then there's something comes into existence, right? And then what's the other repeated phrase?
And so it was.
And then there was evening.
Oh, you get that, but then I'm looking for the phrase that follows right after that. God saw that it was good. Okay, and that's repeated every time. So you have this thing, this story that unfolds in this way. God says, let there be light. And then there's light. And then God says, that was good. And then God says, oh, and now let the waters be separated. And then it's good. And then this, and it's good. This, it's good. So things are happening how? They're happening in sequence or order. There's an orderliness to this, right? It's very orderly, very intentional. God isn't just going, I don't know what, let's see, I don't know, we'll throw a bunch of paint at the wall and see what happens, right? This is God saying, okay, we're going to do this. Now that that's in place, okay, now this is going to be put in place, and now that that's in place, now this is going to be put in place, and now that that's in place, then we can put this in place. And then what's the last thing to show up? The people. And why? Because everything's in place for them to live. Everything they need is now in place, right? So there's this intentionality about it, and an orderliness about it. And so this is a way of the ancient saying, right? We are here on purpose. This is our existence is intentional. We were part of this orderly creation that God was unfolding piece by piece so that everything was in place, so that our lives are the way they are. Now, here's the fascinating thing that I think we can see with this story. This story has the same order of events other than the sun and the moon. It has the same order of events as the scientific record tells us. If you understand that the first day, like when God says, let there be light, if you, instead of saying light, you just say energy. So the first thing is energy. And then things just flow, particularly when the animals show up. So what are the first creatures to show up? Where do they show up? It would be the better question to answer. In the water. What does science tells us? That's where life began, in the water. And then, after land is formed, solid land and whatnot, then things start showing up on land. And you get the plants show up before the other things and so on and so forth. Like it's pretty astounding. Now, again, I don't think that they were trying to be scientific in their writing, but there is logic to this order that things show up. Like these things have to exist before these things can exist, right? So there's a logic to it, there's an orderliness to it, and there is the affirmation that it is good. So sometimes when I'm talking about creation stories with the students, they'll automatically want to jump to Adam and Eve eating the fruit from the tree. They want to get to the bad news part, and it's like, no, you can't get there first. You got to start at the beginning, and the beginning says it is good. And when the humans show up, what does it say? It changes. It's the one time it changes. Instead of saying it is good, it says something different. What's that? It is very good. Right? So this is known by, there was a man named Matthew Fox who wrote a book that was big back in my seminary day called Original Blessing. So his premise was, for too long the church is focused on original sin and have ignored the first chapter of Genesis. But the first chapter of Genesis says this world is good and humans were created good, very good. We, so rather than focus on the sin, which is a reality for our world too, the recognition is, this world is good. Thus, we should treat it good. We should treat one another good. We should see now. We have ways of saying this. Like we say that. Well, okay. What does God say in the very? I'll get you the right verse here. Look at verse 26 because I think this is a really key verse in chapter 1. Verse 26.
Making humankind in your image.
Humans are made in the image of God. What does that mean? That means that we need to treat all humans with dignity and respect because they are made in the image of God. See, this stuff comes out of chapter 1. And it's a way of not discounting humans, but saying humans were made to be good. Humans were made to reflect the image of God, and we still have that capacity, that ability, that is not gone from us. Yes.
Mine is in the message.
Oh, the Message translation, yeah.
And you talk about the Trinity and how the Trinity is involved in
Yeah.
creation. God spoke, let us make human beings in our image.
Yeah.
Make them reflecting our nature.
Yeah, and that's in all translations. That plural, which has fascinated people for years. They've wondered, why is that plural there? And there's two explanations. One of the early Christian theologians said, there it is, right there. There's an indication of the Trinity, right? Others would say that this comes from a time when the Israelite understanding of God, or the Israelite understanding of the way the world worked, that it was actually polytheistic. And I tend to lean more away from that, more to the mystery of that God, there's a recognition of God's being that is beyond our understanding. Yeah. So that's Genesis 1. Order and intention. This affirms that we are here on purpose and not by accident. That God is beyond nature. That God is not the sun or the moon, but rather God is beyond those things, identified by other religions as God. So one of the questions might be asked, well, hold it. How can you have a day if the sun and the moon don't show up until the fourth day? Right? And like were the ancients that out of touch with reality, like they get that mixed up? No, this was intentional and quite possibly to demote the sun and the moon from being God's to being a part of God's creation. So it's a way of saying, so can you tell me what religion, ancient religion, worshiped, for example, the sun as a god? The Egyptians, Ra, right? And so this was like a way of the Israelites saying, you know that thing that in the sky that you worship as a god, that's not a god. That was created by God. So it's a way of kind of saying, no, those things, as powerful and amazing as they are, right? They're not God. So that's maybe why they show up on the fourth day instead of being there in the beginning with God. Because then the Egyptian could say, well, they're in there in the beginning. They're another god with your God. So ancient people had no problem having multiple gods. That was not a problem at all. In fact, so the monotheistic approach of the ancient Israelites was quite unique to the world. You know, the Egyptians would say, "Oh, you're Yahweh? Fine, you can have Yahweh." And then, we'll have, Ra, and all the gods will get together and have a coffee party, and maybe they'll have a fight and figure out which one is the most powerful. But they didn't have a problem with other gods. The unique thing about Judaism and then Christianity that grew out of it was the monotheistic thing. So likewise, the Roman Empire was fine with having lots of gods. And so this new Christian God, you want to have that, that's fine. But, hold it, you want to insist that God is the only God? No, we won't allow that. So, all right, that's the first creation account. We already talked about this. The nature of creation is good. So now let's look at the second creation account. So this starts, chapter 2 I call it, but it starts in 4b. So just scan that one. You know kind of how this goes too, but just scan it quick and then we'll talk about it.
Did you say 4B?
Yep. So what I mean by 4b, Shirley, is my translation starts, in the day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. So it's like a new paragraph in mine. So the second half of verse 4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there you go. Now, chances are you haven't got through the whole thing, but I think you're being reminded of how the story goes. So if you were to pick one word to summarize what is the theme of this story, what word would you pick? I'll try and make it easier for you. I'll start with this. All right, so one of the memorable parts of this story is the creation of Eve, right? All right, so why is Eve created, according to this story?
It is not good that man should be alone.
It is not good that man should be alone. Okay, there's your clue. What is this story about? Relationships. This is all about relationship. And so, in the beginning, we have a very intimate picture of creation here. This is very different than the first one, where God speaks and then things come into being. How is Adam formed? Yeah, so what is the picture? Like what can you imagine happening here? God kneeling down, maybe in the riverbank, right, with the clay, forming like a sculptor, like an artisan, forming this figure, but it's not alive yet, it's just a clay figure, until God does what? Breathes in it. And then it comes to life. But this is literally a hands-on picture. Right? A hands-on picture. And then, when Eve is created, it's further hands-on, because how is Eve created? Yeah, so what does God do to Adam first? Puts him to sleep, and then, like surgery, ancient surgery, takes a rib out of the side, and out of that rib forms Eve. And so it's, again, it's very hands-on, it's very tactile, right? Like, I mean, ancients would absolutely understand what a rib bone was, right? Because, I mean, like that was, and they know that, how do you get out a rib bone? Well, that's going to be painful to cut that out. So what's astounding to me is, like, this is a picture of surgery before they knew about anesthetic. Putting the person to sleep. And yet that's exactly what happens here. Adam is put to sleep, and then this material is drawn out of him. And they didn't understand anything about DNA, but we can understand now that it is possible you have enough DNA material in any single cell that can theoretically be made into another creature, right? I mean, that's the whole Jurassic Park thing, right? And that's astounding. So you could say that another person or another being could be made from the genetic material of one being. You can make another being.
Yeah, well, there was already life in the rib too, eh?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. In the marrow, right? And I don't know if they would understand if the marrow formed blood or not, but I mean, they might have understood that. And blood, of course, was important for life. Blood and breath. And you get the indication of both kind of happening here. So you have this very hands-on thing, but there's other indications of relationship here too, and I wonder if you can pick up on those. What's other ways that relationship is shown in this story? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so what is the first thing that Adam is to do? Name the animals. So when we give something a name, that implies automatically some kind of relationship with it. So instead of saying, hey, you animal over there with the spots and the kind of, you come here. Instead, you can say, hey, leopard, come over here. Hey, you got a beautiful coat. Just want to tell you, I love your spots. They're just great, right? Or whatever. But we name things that we have a relationship with. Even sometimes we'll even name inanimate objects that we have a relationship with. Like, I mean, people used to name their cars, right? And then they would talk to their car, come on, Freddie, you can do it, turn over, or whatever, like. So the fact that Adam is naming is indication of relationship. That God is saying, you are in relationship with these other creatures, right? And recognize that relationship. So you name them. And then we find out it's not good for man to be alone, right? So the indication that humans are meant to be in relationship, right from the get-go. Now, here's my last question about that particular part of the story, right? Why the rib bone? What do you think that signifies? Why not the head bone or the foot bone? I've never heard that explanation before, but I like it. But that's not what I was thinking of. But that's interesting that it protects the breath, and the breath, of course, is the Spirit of God in us. Ah, Jordan, I like that.
It's not a vital piece of the body.
No, you can. That's right. You can lose one rib and still function. That's okay. Think in terms of relationship.
It's beside.
It's beside. Is that what you're going to say, Eric?
I was going to say it protects the heart.
Oh, it protects the heart. So the romantic kind of version. Yeah, protects the heart. Yeah. You romantic guy, you there. Yeah. It's an indication that they're supposed to be partners side by side. Right? That the woman is not supposed to dominate the man, so it's not taken from the head, nor is the woman to be subjected, like underneath his foot, so taken from the foot bone. The fact that it's a rib bone suggests this is a side-by-side partnership. And they are different, but they are equally valuable. And you can't even say because Adam was made first that he's more important than Eve, because I've heard that turned around and said, well, Adam was imperfect, and so God had to try again, and that's how he got Eve. So you can't say that. But I do think that the indication of a side-by-side partnership is what's here. They are to be partners side by side, working together to do what? Now this is interesting. What is their job? What are they supposed to do?
Look after creation.
Look after creation. Exactly. So this garden they're in, they're supposed to take care of it. And they've got everything they need. And it's a beautiful place. And so here's what you can do. Except that, of course, then we get to chapter 3, and it's like they mess things up, right? So, relationship. Humans' relationship both with God and with the world around us. How is indication, how does this story indicate relationship with God? I wonder if you can pick this up.
So the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of,
God's talking.
There you go. There you go. That's exactly it. Okay, God is talking. Talking, and so there's conversation. There appears to be conversation. God is saying, oh, Adam, this is what I want you to do. I want you to name these animals, okay? And so forth. There seems to be conversation. And certainly when you get to chapter 3, absolutely you see the conversation, right? Now, don't eat from the fruit of that tree, and then, hey, what happened? And then there's relationship because they're walking and talking with God. Right? Now, some of that is implied because it's not described in detail, but it's implied that this is what's happening, right? So you've got relationship because of names, you've got relationship because of conversation, and so forth. And the relationship is with God and with one another in terms of humans and with creation. So there's a recognition of partnership of humans with each other and with God. So we are partners with God in sustaining this creation. That's a very important role, and humans have not always done it well. Sometimes we've sought to dominate. So this leads me back to this. Someone raised this yesterday, so I'll bring this back up. You have to go back to chapter 1 now, and you have to look at the verse 26. We already looked at it. That's the verse that talks about being made in the image of God. And there's something in there that, depending on your translation, has led humans to believe that it's our good fortune to dominate the world. So depending on your translation, you'll see that. What does it say? Dominion over. That sounds a lot like have domination over, right? But a better word would be stewardship. Have stewardship over. In other words, this is not your world. This is God's world. God created it, but God has put you in charge of taking care of it like a steward. Now, we don't understand stewards in the same way that they did in biblical times. But a steward would be like someone who, the farmer or whoever, the vineyard owner, owned the vineyards, but I can't be there all the time, so he appoints a steward to take care of the vineyards, when he's not there and whatnot. And that's kind of the human role here, is a role of stewardship, not domination. So someone else put a chat up, and I keep missing those. Oh, responsible.
Way off the path here. But what this is reminding me of is my mom, and she had in her city lot a garden, and she was out there in the garden bringing things up all the time, and it seems to me she was a steward of our yard.
Well, yeah, no, I think so. And in fact, I find it interesting that this is an image of agriculture that you have, because it talks about it being a garden, and it talks about fruit that can be harvested and whatnot. There is a sense in which humans, our very first business or occupation was agriculture. And in fact, there's some historical theories that say civilization cannot even form unless you have agriculture, because otherwise people have to be hunter-gatherers, thus moving around, right? You need to be able to settle in one place to develop civilization, develop culture, and so on and so forth. And this story says that. By the way, did you catch where this is set, the Garden of Eden? You got the Tigris and Euphrates. So that would be modern day where?
Iraq.
Iran.
Iran.
Oh, no, sorry.
Iraq.
You're Iraq. Iraq. It is Iraq. I got Iran on my mind because of Hamas. Yes, Iraq. It's modern day Iraq. So that was known as the Fertile Crescent. It was a good place for agriculture. Right? So that was the theory. Beth.
When you say that these are two
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how distinct they are, because I always kind of assumed that like verse 1 is like the big picture and verse 2 is like zooming in like more detail. Are they actually like different? Like,
Yeah, they are different. Like biblical scholars will say, one of the things they'll say is the language is different. Like the way the words are. Chapter 1 has very much a sense of like almost a worship liturgy. Like there's this thing that they unfold, and then it's almost like the congregation knows that their response when they get to it is, and it was good, right? Like you get that sense. It's more poetic, whereas chapter 2 is certainly more narrative. So scholars will say there's a difference in style, there's a difference in vocabulary, and even in, if I remember correctly, even in the name used for God. But the ancients saw that these two stories belong together because they're giving us a broader picture of what it means to say God is creator, right? And they don't counteract each other except in really small ways. Like chapter 2, the second story, you get this, like you get human, the order of stuff happens a little differently, okay? So the order is a little different, but that's, again, that wouldn't have even mattered to them because they're trying to emphasize, what they're trying to emphasize is the relationship. So you could say, Beth, this is one two-part creation story in the sense that it's trying to tell us two different things about God, and so you get kind of a part A and a part B. You could call it that way. I mean, they're both creation stories. And so you could say it's like one story that has two parts or two perspectives or like two voices. You could think of it that way, right? What scholars will say is that the first 5 books of the Bible, you can see different sections based on the language that's used. And so then they would identify, this was probably written by this group and this was probably written by this group. And then it got compiled. So what we know about the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is its final shape did not really happen until the Babylonian exile. So much, much later. So these stories were around in oral form, and then they get compiled later. And so it's very possible that that's how that happened. Does that kind of answer it? Does your grade 9 class ask questions like this?
No, because I didn't explain to them these are 2 separate stories.
Oh, well, and it's the only reason I bring up the fact that it's 2 separate stories is because I think that the thematic thing is different from both stories. And if you're talking about meaning, what is the meaning of these stories? Then you have to kind of recognize, well, they're kind of approaching things differently. All right, now how are we doing for time? Ooh, we got 6 minutes. Can we do it? Yes, we can. All right, so now, remember I told you we're going to do a contrast? We're going to contrast Genesis, these creation stories, with a different creation story. The Babylonian creation tale known as the Enuma Elish. And it has the god Marduk killing the goddess of primordial chaos, Tiamat, and forms the heaven and earth from her body. Okay? And then, that's not the end of the violence, because then we get Marduk killing one of Tiamat's sons, a rebellious god named Kingu, and combines Kingu's blood with clay and fashions humans from this mixture. And Marduk creates humans to be slaves, to do all the dirty work so that the gods could be free to enjoy leisure. All right? So, anybody remember the cartoon Marmaduke? Yeah, it was like the big dog. I suspect that Marmaduke got its name from Marduk. That's just my guess. But anyways, can you see how radically different that is from the biblical creation stories, right? You got violence, you got accident in a sense, like Marduk kills Tiamat and then her body. There's actually one, and it's not this creation story, but there's another story that I thought was very bizarre. There's a battle between gods, and the one god pulls the other god's arm off and throws it down, and then that becomes a bunch of islands, right? So that's pure accident and pure violence, right? Chaos and violence. Here, by the way, is a picture of, this is an artwork of this Babylonian creation story. So you've got Marduk on the left there going after Tiamat, I think, or maybe Kingu on the right there, or on the left, sorry. So violence. So when you see that, you see, oh, how different the Genesis stories are, because they are not about violence and they're not about subjugation, right? So instead, Genesis 1 says humans are made in the image of God. Here, it's like humans, you're just nothing but slaves to the gods, to do the dirty work that they don't want to do because they want to have fun. Very, very different purpose. So here with the Babylonian version, it's like, what is life? Well, life is terrible. Life is terrible, life is miserable, and we shouldn't expect anything better because that we're just made from the product of violence. So violence is inherent to who we are. That's the Babylonian myth would tell you. Violence is inherent to who we are because we're made from the blood and clay of this violent altercation between gods, right? So sometimes the comparison is really helpful to see the uniqueness of the Genesis stories. Okay? All right, so here's just a quick recap. I love this visualization of the chapter 1 version where you have these. One of the things I like about this particular artwork is it shows the diversity of creation. So one of the things that I think is good to reflect on is just how incredibly diverse our universe is. In other words, God likes diversity, right? Likes all kinds of colors, all kinds of shapes, all kinds of forms, all kinds of textures, all kinds of smells, and on and on and on, right? That diversity is actually part of what makes things beautiful to us. Like when you see sunset and the clouds are quite not uniform, but they're filled with color and different shades of color, you go, wow, that's beautiful, right? And when you just see a blue sky on the horizon, it's like, wow, it's okay. But when you get that diversity, then it's like, oh, those colors, those shapes, that gives us, a sense of beauty and wonder.
When you see the northern lights.
Or the northern lights, yes, the northern lights. Yeah, exactly. And then here's a painting I got of the chapter 2 story, and I like this because you've got the diversity of creatures there, including all kinds of interesting animals. But do you see Eve being created in this painting? It's pretty small for you, so I don't know if you can see it. Can you see Eve?
Oh,
Yeah, so there's Eve. So Adam's asleep. There's God, and he's kind of like almost pulling her out of the side of Adam. It's kind of a bizarre little painting. But again, I like it because it's sort of hands-on. It's almost like this fatherly figure almost picking up a child. That's kind of what I see, right? Almost like, picking up his child. And here you go, Eve, here's life, right? So I like that painting as well. I don't even know who the artist is. I like the little goat there and the horse lying down and ostrich, the owl.
Thanksgiving turkey.
Yeah, maybe a Thanksgiving turkey, maybe. It's hard to say.
Flowers too.
And flowers and trees and yeah.
There's a little rabbit in the bottom right corner there too.
Little rabbit.
Yeah, and the very
Oh yeah, hiding underneath the leaf there. Yeah, really good. That's good, Eric. Yeah. All right, so now we're going to sum up, and the way we're going to sum this up is we're going to look at Luther's explanation of the first article of the Apostles' Creed from the Small Catechism. So from here, okay? So this is what Luther says is the meaning of the phrase, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. He says, it means God has made me and all creatures. That God has given me my body and soul, eyes and ears and all my members, my reason and all my senses, and still takes care of them. Okay? And what I think is interesting here is that Luther is identifying that, like the way we experience life is through our senses. So the fact that we can hear things, we can see things, we can smell things, taste things, so that's how we experience life. And Luther is sort of breaking this down for us, saying, all those things, that is a gift from God. How do I say gift? Because God has given me my body and still takes care of them. So there's the sustaining of life, right? God also gives me clothing and shoes, food and drink, house and home, wife and children, land, animals, and all I have. Now, how is it that God gives me clothes and shoes? Let's just start with that. How is it that God gives me that? Is God manufacturing my shoes?
Well, but we have the intelligence to be able to do it.
Okay, there's one of the things we have. We have intelligence to be able to make these things. What else do we have?
Skilled people that can make them.
Well, we've got skills and raw materials. So it's the raw materials. It's like all the stuff that's needed to make clothes and shoes and drink and food. And, like this is all there because God has put it there, right? Including our ability to make these things out of this stuff, right? Then Luther continues, God richly and daily provides me with all that I need to support this body and life. Daily, there's a key word there, right? Richly and daily provides me all I need to support this body and life.
So Luther wrote that in the 1500s?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. God defends me against all danger and guards and protects me from all evil. Now, do people who have faith in God, do they sometimes succumb to danger? Yeah. So what is Luther saying here? Or is he being blissfully ignorant? I don't think so. I think what Luther is saying is that the ultimate danger and the ultimate evil we are protected against. And so Luther had a strong sense of evil, of Satan attacking him and trying to, and what Luther is saying is that which is the greatest enemy. I talked about this in a funeral sermon the other day. The greatest enemy that we have is the enemy death. And God protects us against death. Not we die, but then but then we have a resurrected life, right? And so that's how Luther would understand that God's protection is ultimate, not necessarily in every moment, right? And so people do, because Luther himself experienced all kinds of danger and problems and troubles and was close to being killed a number of times, right? In his case, yes, but in the case of some of his co-workers, some of the fellow reformers, they were not protected. There was one, what was his name? He was from Holland, and he came to Wittenberg, and he said, this is really good stuff. I'm going to take this back to the people in Holland, and he was executed.
So when was the Apostles' Creed composed?
It took its final form probably in about the 6th century, but we see early versions of it already in the 2nd century. Yeah, but its sort of very final form is sort of the 6th century, but it's pretty similar to what you find in the 4th and 5th. And the creed that it's basically an abbreviated version of the Nicene Creed, which for those of you, this was going to scare some of you off. We're going to use the Nicene Creed on Sunday because it's longer. That's not why we're using it. I'm using it for a different reason. But that's when the Apostles' Creed came into existence. Yeah. And let me tell you how the Apostles' Creed came into existence, because I think that'll be important. It came into existence because of the baptismal rite. So what would happen is people who wanted to be baptized, they would go through their preparation period, their sort of education period, and then as they were about to be baptized, the pastor or leader would ask them, do you believe in God? And the answer would be, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Do you believe in Jesus Christ? I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, conceived by right? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit? I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, communion of saints, and so on and so forth. So it was a part. That's right. That's why we do it still in baptism, right? Except that in the early church, most of the baptisms were adults, so they could answer themselves. Now we have the parents saying it along with the congregation. But originally, it was the individual would say that affirmation. And they were taught that creed as it was almost like a secret that was so important that you can't write it down. You had to memorize it. Because, of course, in the earliest church, there was still persecution, right? So okay, we're going to tell you this secret, almost, and you have to learn this, but you can't write it down. It's interesting stuff. So.
Tell you, but I'll have to kill you.
yeah, almost, eh? Now, this is how Luther ends. All this God does out of fatherly divine goodness and mercy without any merit or worthiness in me. In other words, it's all a gift. It's nothing I earned. In fact, this whole creation was put in place way before I showed up on the scene. So I can't take any credit for anything. It's all gift. And Luther, so if it's all gift, what is our response? What do you think?
To be thankful.
Yeah, to be thankful. So then Luther says, for all this, it is my duty to thank, praise, serve, and obey him. And that's how Luther understands the meaning of what it means to say God is creator. To say God is creator should result in a life of gratitude. A life of gratitude. And so, with that, folks, we made it. And sorry, I was overtime. I actually was on time yesterday morning, just bang on. I went 8 minutes over, so my apologies. Any questions or comments to wrap up?
I have this whole thing all underlined.
Like some of the articles I read, Shirley, where I highlighted, and it's like the whole page is yellow. Yeah, it's like. So this ends this unit, and the next unit will begin in the middle of January. And what we will be looking at there is specifically what Christians believed about Jesus. So the second article. And we possibly might get into the third article, which is about the Holy Spirit. But we're going to look about what Jesus, how early Christians understood Jesus, and how that relates to then faith today. That's where we're going in January. So, all right. Thank you very much for your participation and your attention. And I hope you have a good night. Stay warm. It's cold out there. And stay safe.
And thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So imagine if I one of those ships going and they have no map.
All right, I'm going to assume that Heather and Joan, you're still out there. I'm just say good night, and then I'm going to end the. Oh, there's the way. Thank you. Good night, Heather. All right.